just a nurse playing doctor. That's what Pastor Marcus Pierce said during the volunteer meeting upstairs, his voice carrying through the basement clinic walls like something with weight and purpose. Brooke Sullivan folded gauze in the cramped room below, fold, align, stack, her hands moving through the motions with the kind of precision that comes from muscle memory older than most people's marriages. The basement smelled like bleach and institutional coffee that had been sitting in a carafe since 6 in the morning, the fluorescent lights overhead humming their constant irritating frequency, 2 of them flickering in a pattern that would have driven most people insane but didn't touch her. The walls of the basement clinic were institutional cinder block painted a color that could only be described as surrender, some shade between beige and giving up. Metal shelving units held donated medical supplies in neat rows, ace bandages, antibiotic ointment, sterile gauze packs, blood pressure cuffs that had seen better years, oxygen concentrators with their cords carefully coiled. A metal desk pushed into the corner held volunteer schedules and medication inventory sheets. Everything about the space whispered temporary, borrowed, not quite official, and that was exactly how Brooke needed it. Pierce's voice drifted down the open stairwell, authoritative and smooth like a soundtrack playing in a store you didn't want to shop in. We appreciate civilian enthusiasm, but there are protocols. Liability concerns. Insurance protocols exist for a reason. When untrained individuals take medical action, they expose our church to catastrophic risk. A pause. She could hear him breathing, drawing the moment out for effect. Last week, one of our volunteers moved a choking victim's neck without proper training. Could have caused a spinal injury. Could have paralyzed that person. Could have ended this entire program. The choking victim had been Marcus Wilson, 63, severe copped, who'd aspirated a piece of communion bread during the Wednesday evening service. His airway had been closing. Brooke had watched from across the room as the volunteer paramedic, a well-meaning accountant named Derek who took a Red Cross course once, froze completely. Derek's hands had trembled. His mouth had opened and closed like he was trying to remember what sound was. The choking victim's eyes had gone from panic to desperate to something worse than that in about 15 seconds, his skin darkening from pink toward purple. She'd repositioned his airway using a technique she'd learned in the sand 17 years ago, one that didn't require any equipment, just hands that knew exactly where the hyoid bone lived and how to move soft tissue without damage. She'd been standing beside him in 3 seconds. His breathing had normalized in 5. Nobody had told her to move. She'd just done it. Now, upstairs, Pastor Pierce was explaining to the assembled volunteers why her presence was a liability. Brooke folded another gauze square. The motion was meditative, each corner precise. She could hear the murmur of nervous laughter from the group upstairs, that particular sound people made when they weren't sure if they were allowed to find something funny yet, so they laughed quietly, testing the waters. She didn't need to see their faces to know what was happening, everyone agreeing with Pierce because he had authority and a speaking voice that sounded like it came from someone important, someone who'd never had to make a decision that cost lives. Perhaps we should suggest she focus on supply organization, Pierce continued, his tone becoming almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. There's no shame in supporting the real medical professionals. More laughter. Louder this time. Permission granted. Brooke's jaw tightened. She didn't look up from the gauze. She didn't stop folding. 23 minutes later, one of the volunteers descended the basement stairs with the careful, apologetic movements of someone bringing bad news. It was Janet, a retired administrative assistant with kind eyes and the exhausted politeness of someone who'd spent a lifetime saying things she didn't mean in offices she didn't like. "Brooke, honey, Pastor Pierce asked if you'd mind focusing on the supply rotation instead of the clinic floor for a while. Just until the insurance situation gets clarified." Janet's voice had that particular tremor that came from delivering messages you didn't believe in but felt obligated to pass along. Brooke nodded once, slowly, without looking up from the donation bin she was organizing. "Of course. Thank you for letting me know. I'm sorry. I don't think," Janet started. "It's fine," Brooke said, and she meant it in a way that made it worse. She wasn't angry. Anger would have been something Janet could work with, something human and recognizable. Instead, she just looked tired in a way that suggested she'd seen this particular dance before and knew exactly how the steps went. Janet retreated upstairs, leaving Brooke alone with the supplies and the fluorescent light hum. Later that afternoon, someone had taped a cartoon image to the vending machine on the wall outside the basement clinic, a stick figure with exaggerated breasts and a head mirror, labeled, "Plays Doctor," in blue marker. The handwriting looked like it belonged to Derek, the accountant paramedic. The kind of thing that probably seemed funny in the moment, with peer pressure and group dynamics working in your favor, with someone you respected having just essentially called you incompetent. Brooke saw it when she came out to refill the water dispenser. She stood looking at it for exactly 4 seconds. Her left hand, the one with the tremor in the pinky, the one that had held 3 dying men alive while moving through 200 meters of live fire on a Tuesday afternoon in Baghdad, formed a fist. The tremor made her fingers shake, not from fear but from scar tissue and nerve damage, the permanent souvenir of an operation that had technically never happened. She reached up and pulled the cartoon down without tearing the vending machine. The tape came away clean. She dropped the paper in the trash and continued filling the water dispenser. Nobody said anything to her about it. That night, in the small apartment she rented 2 blocks from Denver General Hospital, Brooke hung her jacket carefully over the back of the kitchen chair like she always did. The jacket was old, faded black, the kind of thing you could wear anywhere and nobody would remember it because it was precisely designed not to be memorable. She'd owned it for 12 years. It had been remade once, relined, carefully maintained like a secret. She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that was cooling into something undrinkable and reached inside the jacket lining, locating the small seam that nobody would ever find unless they were looking specifically for it. The fabric was worn soft there from repetitive fingers. The patch was faded to almost nothing, a unit designation so old that half the colors had bleached out under the desert sun and the years. 75th Ranger Regiment. Valkyrie Team. For letters that meant she'd carried 3 men out of a burning vehicle while rounds punched through the metal like angry hornets. For letters that meant she'd stopped existing according to every official database in the Pentagon. For letters that meant she could not be here, could not be working in this church basement clinic in Denver, could not be anyone at all. She traced the patch with her index finger, her thumb brushing the edge where the stitching was starting to fray. 5 seconds. 10. 20. 30. The apartment was completely silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic from the street outside, Denver at evening, that particular Denver rhythm of people going home or going out or going nowhere. She folded the jacket lining carefully and stepped back. 2 days later, on a grey Sunday afternoon when the weather was undecided about whether to rain or just threaten it, the church doors opened during evening service and a man came in carrying another man. The standing man was young, military-bearing in the way that never quite went away no matter how long you'd been civilian, his arm under the shoulder of a heavier man whose eyes had gone unfocused and distant. They were both soaked through with Denver rain. Pastor Pierce, who had been explaining the doctrine of grace to 47 people who were thinking about dinner, stopped mid-sentence and watched them with the expression of someone calculating liability. Brooke was in the back, restocking the hymnals because that was her job now, supply organization, shelf management, things that didn't require the kind of knowledge that lived in her hands. She saw them before anyone else did. She saw the stumble in the standing man's gait, the way his companion's head lolled slightly, the blue tint to lips that suggested something was wrong with oxygen or pressure or both. She was moving before she consciously decided to move. This was how muscle memory worked. The decision was made by someone 7,000 miles away and 17 years ago, and her current self was just the vehicle for carrying it out. The man carrying his companion staggered slightly when Brooke appeared, not from fear but from exhaustion. She took the weight without asking permission, gauging the collapse of the companion's airway by the sound of his breathing, a wet rattle that meant fluid, meant pressure, meant the kind of thing that went bad in minutes. "Supply closet," she said to the standing man. "Now." It wasn't a request. She'd moved into command voice without meaning to, the kind of tone that made people follow because their bodies understood authority before their minds caught up. The standing man didn't argue. He followed her to the basement, to the climate-controlled supply closet where they kept the donated medical equipment. She laid the companion on the floor with practiced gentleness and checked him systematically: airway, breathing, circulation, the alphabet of first response that lived in her muscle memory like prayer. His eyes were closed. His left forearm bore a tattoo in faded blue ink: B. Sullivan, Baghdad 2007. The room seemed to narrow. The air pressure changed. Everything moved in slow motion and at hyperspeed simultaneously, the way trauma did when it recognized itself. She kept her hands moving, kept the rhythm of her assessment mechanical and professional, because there were other people in the world and she couldn't afford for any of them to see what her face was doing. His vitals were bad but salvageable. She had minutes before this became something she couldn't fix alone. Behind them, upstairs in the sanctuary, Pastor Pierce was still mid-sentence about grace and forgiveness, and nobody was listening anymore because the room had gone completely silent except for the distant sound of rain against the windows. When it was done, vitals stabilized, oxygen flowing, the companion's breathing settling into something that resembled normal, Brooke released him and stood up in the supply closet, her hands shaking not from fear but from the particular exhaustion that came from running on combat reserves in a basement in Colorado. 30 minutes later, the companion had been transported to Denver General by ambulance. The standing man, who'd introduced himself as Derek from the accounting firm and who looked nothing like the Derek with the marker and the cartoon nurse, had gone with him, leaving Brooke alone in the supply closet with the shelves and the donated equipment and the knowledge that there was someone in this city who had her name written on his skin. She reached up to the small seam in her jacket lining, the one with the patch that said she didn't exist, and her fingers traced it for 5 silent seconds. In the darkness of the supply closet, with nothing but the sound of her own breathing, she understood that the carefully constructed invisibility she'd built, the careful years of being nobody, the deliberate choice to fold gauze instead of save lives, the acceptance of being called a liability and a danger, had just become the most dangerous thing in the room. Because someone remembered. Someone's body remembered even if his mind didn't. And that was a problem that wouldn't stay in a supply closet for long. 3 days passed like slow-motion film. The kind of waiting that teaches you things about yourself you'd rather not know. Brooke folded donated blankets in the church basement, her movements mechanical, precise, the way her hands had learned to work in field hospitals where efficiency meant the difference between a life saved and a body bagged. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their constant irritating song, and somewhere upstairs, the organ wheezed through Thursday's choir practice. She didn't hear any of it. Not really. Her mind was still tracing the hidden patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the faded 75th Ranger Regiment insignia, the one thing that could never be unlearned, unseen, unworn. Pastor Pierce had made his position unmistakably clear during Tuesday's meeting in the fellowship hall. 30 volunteers had gathered on folding chairs, coffee cups steaming, and he'd stood at the front like a man certain of his moral authority. His voice had carried the particular timbre of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Last week, Miss Sullivan here decided to play doctor with a choking victim, he'd announced, his eyes finding her in the back row. Repositioned his airway without training, without authorization. This is exactly the kind of liability that endangers our insurance standing. The room had gone quiet in that specific way crowds do when someone's being publicly diminished. We appreciate enthusiasm, but untrained civilians need to understand their limitations. Perhaps Miss Sullivan would be better suited to sweeping floors. Or folding bulletins. Nervous laughter rippled through the volunteers like a contagion. Brooke's jaw had tightened, just barely, the muscle flexing once beneath her skin, but her face remained composed, a mask worn so long it had become muscle memory. She'd said nothing. Not a word. Not a defense. Not even a glance in his direction. Her hands had remained steady in her lap. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. What happened next didn't require words. Someone had taped a cartoon nurse to the vending machine the next morning, red marker scrawled beneath it, "Plays Doctor." 2 volunteers had been standing there laughing when Brooke arrived for the afternoon shift. She'd pulled coins from her pocket, 3 quarters, 2 dimes, 1 nickel, the exact change, inserted them without hesitation, and selected a black coffee. The machine had hissed and delivered the cup. She turned and walked past the still snickering volunteers without acknowledgement, returned upstairs to fold donated blankets, and continued her work as if Pierce's public mockery and the cartoon and the laughter were simply weather, something that happened but didn't touch her. That Wednesday morning, Pierce had called her into his office. The space smelled of old furniture polish and something else, the particular scent of institutional authority, that blend of mahogany and leather and the faint copper tang of coins in a donation plate. His desk was obsessively organized, papers arranged in military precision. The irony wasn't lost on her. He'd sat behind it like a judge pronouncing sentence, his fingers steepled, his voice dropping to the register men use when they're certain they hold all the power. If you touch another patient without explicit authorization, I will call security and have you removed from this property. Do you understand? His eyes were small and calculating. They were also afraid, though he didn't know it yet. Afraid of what he'd seen her do, afraid that she might understand something he'd been carefully hiding in spreadsheets and billing statements. Do I make myself clear? Brooke had met his eyes, just for a moment, long enough to show she'd heard, not so long as to be challenging. Understood, Pastor. Her voice had been soft, clinical, the voice of someone who'd learned to report status in the midst of chaos. She'd stood and turned toward the door. He'd watched her go, satisfied. Victorious, even. That was the mistake people always made with her. They saw the composure and interpreted it as surrender. They didn't understand that the absence of reaction was itself a weapon, that silence held more power than 1,000 arguments ever could. Later, alone in the supply closet reorganizing gauze and ace bandages, Brooke had closed her eyes and traced her fingers across the hidden patch one more time. 5 seconds. That was all she allowed herself. 5 seconds of touching the faded embroidered insignia, feeling the weight of what it represented, what she'd become and what she'd tried to forget. Then she'd straightened, smoothed her scrubs, and returned to her work. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Pierce didn't understand what he'd set in motion, didn't comprehend that the woman he'd pushed into a corner was someone who'd been trained to survive in far worse conditions than volunteer work at a Denver church. He didn't know that she'd noticed the inventory discrepancies 2 weeks ago, the medication counts that never matched his billing statements, the $340,000 in fraudulent reimbursements flowing to his nephew's street operation. He didn't know that her observation skills, honed across 3 tours and a field promotion to captain, had already catalogued every inconsistency in his carefully constructed theft. He didn't know any of it. And he had no idea what was about to walk through those sanctuary doors. 3 days later, Wednesday evening service. The church was full, 200 congregants packed into the pews, the choir robed and ready, the organ player warming up the hymn for the evening's opening. Brooke was in the back organizing hymnals in their wall slots, her movements methodical, her mind still partially in Baghdad, still calculating angles and distances and response times the way those calculations had become reflexive. Some skills never left you. Some muscle memory never faded. Then Commander Rake seized. It happened in the 4th row from the front, during the first verse of the Amazing Grace. His wheelchair tipped backward as his body went rigid, his head snapping back, white foam appearing at the corners of his mouth. His eyes rolled up, showing nothing but whites, the seizure patterns wrong, all wrong, the progression suggesting something far more catastrophic than epilepsy. A stroke, maybe. An aneurysm rupturing. Something that would take him in minutes without intervention. The crowd gasped. Someone screamed. The organ player stopped mid-note, the silence that followed so complete you could hear the rain beginning to hammer against the stained glass windows outside. Derek, the volunteer paramedic, a nervous college kid studying pre-med who'd taken a first aid course last spring, froze with his hands hovering uselessly above Rake's convulsing body. Pastor Pierce pushed through the crowd, his voice booming with the authority of someone certain he controlled the situation. Everyone step back. Don't touch him, we're calling 911. We wait for professionals. His eye swept the sanctuary and found Brooke. The look he gave her was unmistakable, a warning. A threat. Stay in your place. She was already moving. Muscle memory took over. The civilian hesitation evaporated. Her body operated on protocols written in blood and sand, responses calibrated across 3 tours and countless field emergencies. She reached Rake in seconds, her fingers finding his neck, feeling for the carotid pulse, finding instead something that made her hands go absolutely still. An aneurysm bulge. The arterial pressure building, the vessel wall weakening with every heartbeat, minutes at most before catastrophic rupture and hemorrhagic stroke. "I need a pen, sterilized alcohol wipes, and everyone back now," she said. Her voice had dropped an octave. Not a request. A command. Derek stammered something about waiting for ambulance personnel. Pierce grabbed her shoulder, his fingers digging in. "Miss Sullivan, I gave you explicit instructions." She shrugged him off with controlled force that wasn't quite violent, that sat on the knife edge between self-defense and assault, and turned back to Rake. Her hands moved with the precision of someone who'd done this before, who'd performed field procedures with shells exploding overhead and blood soaking through her gloves. She found the sterilized pen cartridge someone had thrust toward her, the plastic cylinder of a Bic ballpoint, the kind hospitals kept for exactly these emergencies, and located the insertion point, second intercostal space, midclavicular line. The anatomy was identical to every human body she'd ever treated. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaped, actual air, released pressure that had been building toward a fatal rupture. Rake's breathing stabilized. Color returned to his face. His body went limp as the seizure released him, as his brain received oxygen again, as his life was measured out in millimeters and milliseconds and the steady hands of someone the church had been trying to erase. The entire sanctuary went motionless. 200 witnesses. 200 people who'd laughed at the cartoon on the vending machine, who'd shifted uncomfortably during Pierce's public humiliation, who'd watched a woman absorb insults without flinching. Now they watched her save a man's life with the clinical precision of someone trained in the worst conditions imaginable. Pastor Pierce's face went crimson. Deep red, the color of anger and fear and the sudden, terrifying realization that the authority he'd constructed was built on sand. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. Nothing came out. Sirens wailed in the distance, getting closer. The ambulance wouldn't arrive for 4 more minutes. Rake didn't need 4 more minutes. Rake needed what he'd already received, the kind of care that only came from someone whose hands had learned precision in the midst of chaos, someone whose muscle memory transcended civilian boundaries. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It ended everything Pierce had carefully constructed. Monday morning, Pierce made his calls. His first call, at 8:06 a.m., was to the Diocese Safety Board. His voice was measured, professional, the tone of a man whose authority had been challenged and who now needed to assert control through institutional channels. "Yes, hello, I need to report a serious incident of unauthorized medical practice at our facility. A volunteer, name of Sullivan, performed an emergency medical procedure without any credentials, without authorization, on one of our congregants. Reckless endangerment, liability nightmare. I've already documented everything." The voice on the other end asked questions. Pierce answered with the precision of someone who'd been preparing this narrative, who understood how to weaponize bureaucracy. His second call, at 9:15 a.m., went to the liability insurance investigator. Different tone, same message. "I have an unlicensed practitioner performing medical procedures at our facility. She positioned herself as a volunteer but has been administering an authorized medical treatment. I need a full investigation before our liability exposure becomes catastrophic." The investigator, experienced with church claims, documented everything. Unlicensed. Unauthorized. Medical practice. The words had weight. The words had teeth. The third call, at 10:03 a.m., went to Denver Public Health. "I'm requesting a background check and investigation of a woman named Brooke Sullivan. She's been displaying suspicious medical knowledge at our facility, performing procedures without proper licensing or authorization. I'm concerned about public safety." The official on the other end made notes. Public health violations carried real consequences. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't the thing that was going to destroy him. That was only the beginning of what happened when you tried to erase someone who'd been trained by the United States military to survive erasure. By Tuesday afternoon, the church office was cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. 2 Denver police officers stood in the doorway with a document folded in half, their badges catching the fluorescent light like fish scales. One of them looked genuinely uncomfortable. The other just looked tired. Brooke was restocking gauze packets in the supply closet when they found her, her hand steady, her movements precise, folding each box into its designated slot with the same care a surgeon might use arranging instruments before a procedure. "Ms. Sullivan." The first officer's voice was careful, the kind officers use when they don't want to escalate something that's already broken. She turned. Her eyes took them in, the uniforms, the document, the way the second officer wouldn't quite meet her gaze. She already knew. Had known since Monday morning when she didn't receive a single text, email, or phone call about the volunteer schedule. When Pastor Pierce passed her in the hallway and didn't even acknowledge her presence, just walked past with the small smile of someone who'd already won. The officer extended the folded paper. "This is a notice of trespass. You're being prohibited from entering church property indefinitely, effective immediately, pending investigation into unauthorized medical practice on these premises." The words hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed-out candle. Unauthorized medical practice. As if the man currently recovering in a hospital bed 3 blocks away, the commander with her name tattooed on his forearm, would be recovering anything at all if she'd waited for professionals, if she'd stepped back like Pierce had demanded, if she'd let him seize until the paramedics arrived 8 minutes too late. Brooke took the document. The paper was heavier than she expected, the kind of weight that comes from official seals and legal language. She read it once. Every word. The citation number. The date. The signature of the district attorney's office. Then she folded it precisely along the crease it already had, and again, making a smaller rectangle, the kind of fold that came from 17 years of military discipline, everything reduced to efficient, manageable sizes. She placed it in her jacket pocket without speaking. "Do you understand the terms?" the first officer asked, and there was something in his tone that suggested he already knew she understood. That she'd probably understood things they would never understand. "I understand," Brooke said. Her voice was level, unmarked by anything resembling emotion. She didn't ask for details. Didn't ask what would happen if she returned. Didn't ask anything at all. She simply nodded, the kind of acknowledgement a soldier gives when receiving orders, clear, complete, no questions. The officers exchanged a glance. The second one finally looked at her, and in that look was something complicated. Recognition, maybe. Or shame. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "Commander Rake is doing great. My brother-in-law is a nurse at Denver General. Says the procedure you did saved his life. That an aneurysm like that, without immediate decompression." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Brooke's jaw didn't clench. Her eyes didn't water. She simply inclined her head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement that was neither acceptance nor rejection. Just information received. She returned to the supply closet, and the officers left, their footsteps echoing down the hallway in a rhythm like a ticking clock counting down to something neither of them could stop. From his office window on the 2nd floor, Pastor Pierce watched as she emerged from the church building 20 minutes later. He leaned back in his leather chair, the expensive one that cost more than most volunteers made in a month, and allowed himself the smallest smile. The smile of someone who had made a problem disappear through nothing but strategic phone calls and institutional power. He'd done exactly what he told himself he would do. Eliminated the threat. Protected the church. Protected himself. What he saw was Brooke walking toward the outdoor laundry line, where clean white sheets and blue volunteer scrubs hung from the wire like flags surrendering. She moved with no particular urgency. Just a woman finishing her volunteer duties on what would be her last day. Pierce could see her shoulders from this angle, the way she carried herself, submissive, diminished, exactly as he'd orchestrated. The trespass notice had worked perfectly. The phone calls had worked perfectly. Everything had worked perfectly. She reached the laundry basket, a plastic bin filled with damp scrubs that needed folding. Rain had been threatening all morning, and the sky hung low and grey over Denver, the kind of grey that promised weather without committing to it. Brooke began folding methodically, taking each garment from the basket and shaking it out, the snap of wet fabric sharp in the still air. She folded the sleeves inward, then lengthwise, creating a rectangle with corners so precise you could measure them with a protractor. Hospital corners. The kind of fold that only someone who had worked in a hospital long enough for it to become muscle memory would know how to make. Each scrub top received the same treatment. Fold. Crease. Stack. The movements were hypnotic in their precision, and anyone watching, and Pierce was watching very carefully from his office window, might have mistaken the methodical attention for something therapeutic, something meditative. What Pierce couldn't see was what was happening in Brooke's mind as her hands performed this ritual. Didn't see that the folding wasn't distraction. It was testimony. She was documenting. Recording. Sealing away everything this place had been to her, the volunteer role she'd played, the invisibility she'd maintained, the constant self-reduction that came with choosing to be nobody important. With each fold, she was putting that version of herself away. Filing it. Storing it. Preparing to be something else. The blue fabric of the scrubs was the exact shade used at Seattle General 1,500 miles away, where she'd worked under her real credentials once, before everything changed. Before the operation in Baghdad went wrong. Before the Pentagon decided that Captain Brooke Sullivan was more useful as a ghost than as a soldier. The shade brought back the smell of antiseptic and floor wax, the sound of monitors beeping in rhythm, the weight of a stethoscope around her neck. All of it gone now. All of it erased like it had never happened. She placed the last folded scrub into the donation bin, an industrial-sized plastic container that would be picked up by a charitable organization and distributed to clinics and community health centers across Colorado. Some volunteer somewhere would unfold this blue top and wear it. Wouldn't know it had been folded by someone who'd pulled men from burning vehicles under mortar fire. Wouldn't know about the captain inside the nurse. Wouldn't know that invisible people had been keeping their hospital running. From his window, Pierce watched her place her hands on the edge of the laundry basket, empty now, the job complete. He watched her pause there for exactly 5 seconds, not a tremor, not a sigh, just a pause like someone might take after finishing any routine task. Then she turned and walked back into the church building to collect her belongings. What Pierce didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that 5-second pause had triggered something. The moment Denver Public Health received the report about suspicious medical knowledge, an automated flag was raised in a classified database maintained by the Joint Special Operations Command at MacDill Air Force Base in Florida. A flag on the name Brooke Sullivan, buried under 3 layers of official denial and operation security. When the insurance investigator ran the background check, a second flag appeared. And when the diocese contacted the state medical board, a third. 3 flags in 96 hours, all converging on the same woman, all pinging the same classified operations desk where someone was finally, after 15 months, going to ask the question that should have been asked long ago: where was Operation Buried Angels field medic? The one who disappeared into civilian life after Fallujah? The one who was never supposed to contact anyone from her unit, never supposed to reveal what happened, never supposed to do anything except exist as a ghost in other people's stories. But a ghost can't save a SEAL commander's life and stay invisible. A ghost can't perform field decompression under fluorescent church lights in front of 200 witnesses and remain erased. Once you move, actually save someone, actually use the skills they spent 7 years training into your muscle and bone, you create a signature. You create evidence. You create a trail that leads directly back to you, no matter how carefully you've buried it. Pierce finished his coffee, still warm, and returned to his computer where the medication inventory spreadsheet was open on his screen. Another $8,400 in supplies he'd marked as distributed to the church clinic, but which had actually gone to his nephew on the northeast side, who sold them in packages that moved through the neighborhood with reliable momentum. The fraudulent reimbursements were perfectly hidden in the noise of legitimate charitable work. Thousands of dollars flowing from the diocese into his accounts, week after week, completely undetected because no one was looking closely enough. Because the person who might have looked closely, the volunteer who actually cared about the inventory, had just been removed from the building. He saved the spreadsheet and closed the file. Perfect. Everything was perfect. The threat was gone. The money would keep flowing. Life would continue exactly as he'd designed it. 18 hours later, the first phone would ring. Then the second. Then nothing in Pierce's life would ever be perfect again, but he didn't know that yet, and neither did he know that the quiet woman folding scrubs in the parking lot had just stopped being invisible, that the moment she used her actual skills instead of hiding them, she'd sent a signal so loud that 50 soldiers in dress whites would hear it and start moving toward Denver on helicopters and military transport planes, ready to come home for their medic. But for now, there was just the rain starting to fall, just the scrubs in the donation bin, just the empty laundry basket, and Pastor Pierce in his office, completely unaware that something much larger than him had just noticed his existence and was preparing to dismantle it with the precision of a surgical procedure he would never survive. Thursday morning arrived like any other day in Brooke Sullivan's carefully constructed invisibility. She pushed through the church office doors at 7:15, expecting to collect her jacket from the administrative assistant and leave without speaking to anyone. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, that familiar institutional sound that followed her everywhere. She'd worn the same scrubs for days in a row now, the only clothes that fit without questions, without the need for explanation. The trespass notice was still taped to the fellowship hall entrance, her name printed in official font, unauthorized medical practice. Trespasser. It hadn't bothered her. Notices were just paper. What bothered her was that Marcus had seen it. Her jacket hung on the coat rack beside Pierce's office door. Brooke reached for it without knocking, moving with the efficient precision of someone who'd spent 18 years learning how to take up the least possible space. The patch was still there, sewn inside the lining where it had been for 16 years. Faded olive drab. 75th Ranger Regiment. She'd checked it 100 times, always in private, always in the dark. The stitching was coming loose on the bottom corner. She'd need to fix that. She could do surgical repairs in her sleep. Miss Sullivan. Pierce's voice cut across the room like a scalpel. He emerged from his office, coffee mug in hand, that same patronizing smile stretched across his face. I hope you've learned something about staying in your lane. He said it softly, almost gently, which made it worse. Not anger. Condescension. The worst kind of violence, the kind that didn't leave bruises. Brooke held the jacket against her chest and nodded once. Her jaw tightened. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. 16 years of restraint, compressed into a single moment. She'd learned long ago that silence was a weapon. Silence meant Pierce would never know how close she was to telling him exactly what she was, exactly what she'd done, exactly how many men she'd saved while he was still writing thank you notes to his donors. She didn't say any of that. Then the fellowship hall doors burst open like a breaching charge. Marcus ran through them at full speed, his 17-year-old frame nearly colliding with the coat rack. He was carrying something, a wooden shadowbox, polished oak, the kind used for presentation-grade displays. His face was flushed, eyes bright, breathing hard like he'd sprinted the entire 6 blocks from his school. Mom! Mom, they need to see these, he shouted, his voice carrying through the small office and into the sanctuary beyond. They called the house. They said it was urgent. I brought them. I brought everything. Brooke's face went white. Not pale. White. The color of someone watching an avalanche begin to slide. Marcus, no, she started, but he was already opening the shadowbox. The medals caught the morning light streaming through the office windows. Stained glass threw fragments of color across the polished wood, reds and blues and golds refracting through images of saints Brooke had never believed in but had always respected. The first medal was immediate and unmistakable. Bronze star with Valor device. Attached to a ribbon the color of old blood. Next to it, 2 purple hearts, the purple hearts that meant she'd bled in places the world wasn't supposed to know existed. Below those, a combat medical badge, a caduceus crossed with a rifle, marking her as someone who'd treated casualties under fire. And at the bottom, polished gold bars. Captain's insignia. Pastor Pierce's smile faltered. His coffee mug lowered. His jaw moved without sound, the way a fish's does when pulled from water. The door to the sanctuary opened wider. Commander James Rake sat in his wheelchair, pushed by a Marine Corps colonel in dress blues, the same officer who'd been visiting him daily, the one who'd held his hand when the nightmares came. Rake stared at the shadowbox for 3 full seconds. Something moved behind his eyes, something struggling to surface through the fog of traumatic brain injury and 17 surgeries and the medications that kept him functional but distant. He whispered her name, but not her name. Valkyrie. His voice cracked. His weathered hands gripped the wheelchair arms, knuckles white. His eyes, which had been vacant for 6 weeks, suddenly focused with the intensity of a military laser finding its target. When he lifted his left arm, the one with the faded tattoo Brooke had only glimpsed once, the night he collapsed, the entire office seemed to stop breathing. "That was your call sign," he whispered. "Baghdad. You pulled me out. I couldn't remember your face, but I never forgot your name." He stared at the tattoo on his own forearm like he was seeing it for the first time. Brooke Sullivan. 2007. Brooke's composure finally fractured. Not in a tremor or a collapse. Just tears, clean, silent, the kind that came from bones remembering what the mind had been ordered to forget. She didn't wipe them away. She just let them fall. Then the sound hit. Boots on tile. Synchronized. Not running. Not panicked. Measured. Military. The sound of discipline moving through space. The door opened again and a Marine Corps colonel stepped into the office, not the one with Rake, a different one, older, his uniform decorated with ribbons that represented decades of decisions made in rooms where civilians weren't invited. He stopped when he saw the shadowbox. His spine straightened. His hand moved to his cap. "Attention!" His voice cut through the office like a command that didn't require explanation. The sanctity of the church meant nothing in this moment. The authority of his bearing transcended brick and stained glass. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket, official, creased, aged. "Citation for Bronze Star with Valor," he read, his voice steady and formal, the kind of voice used at military funerals and medal ceremonies. "For exceptional courage under fire while extracting wounded personnel from a compromised position in Baghdad, Captain Sullivan carried 3 men including Commander Rake through 200 meters of active engagement while sustaining injuries consistent with high-velocity fragmentation." "This is a church, not a military installation," Pierce said, his voice rising, trying to reassert whatever authority he'd imagined having. "I don't care what medals she." The outer doors opened. A 2-star general entered in dress uniform, grey at the temples, the kind of man whose presence made the air pressure change. He saw the shadowbox and stopped. He didn't speak. He simply rendered a crisp salute, fist to chest, held for 2 seconds, then released. The gesture was absolute. It was recognition. It was acknowledgement of rank and sacrifice in a language Pierce would never speak. "Captain Sullivan," the general said, his voice like gravel over polished steel. "I served with your battalion commander. Operation Buried Angel, Fallujah, 2007. Your service record is classified, but I know what you did there." More footsteps. 2 men in dark suits carrying a folder stamped classified in red letters large enough to be visible from across the room. The first staffer, mid-40s, expression like someone reading autopsy reports, spoke directly to Pierce. "We're here to verify the status of Operation Buried Angel Participant Nightingale 7. Captain Brooke Sullivan, call sign Valkyrie. Your background check request triggered federal review and automatic notification to the Department of Defense. This woman is part of a classified protection protocol. She was ordered into invisibility by direct Pentagon authorization following a black site extraction that was subsequently buried for national security purposes." Brooke's hand was still holding the jacket. The patch was still inside, still waiting to be discovered, still holding her identity in stitches that were coming loose. But the patch didn't matter anymore. Everything was visible now. Everything was known. Commander Rake wheeled himself closer, moving with the determined effort of someone relearning how bodies worked. "She carried me out," he said, his voice stronger now, memory finding its pathway. The Humvee caught fire. Direct hit. I was gone. But she came back in. She had blood on her face, not hers. Ours. All of us. She carried me out and then she went back for Martinez and then she went back for Chen. 3 men. 200 meters. Live fire the whole way. The general nodded slowly. Her personnel file shows 17 combat saves. 4 of those under direct fire. 2 under conditions that should have been unsurvivable. She sustained injuries consistent with shrapnel fragmentation, the colonel added, still holding the citation. The after-action report was classified, but the medical personnel who treated her said she'd taken shrapnel meant for Commander Rake. Stayed conscious long enough to ensure all 3 men reached the casualty collection point, then accepted treatment. Marcus held the shadowbox higher, tears streaming down his teenage face. "My mom's a hero," he said quietly. "She's always been a hero. I just didn't know the whole world was supposed to know it too." The rumble began outside. Not thunder. Not weather. The sound of vehicles arriving in coordinated sequence, moving with military precision through Denver's morning traffic. Through the stained glass windows, shapes became visible. Uniforms. Dress whites. The kind of gathering that didn't happen by accident. Outside, 50 Navy SEALs in formation were arriving at the church. Pastor Pierce's face had gone the color of old water. The diocesan investigator's voice crackled through Pastor Pierce's office phone like a verdict delivered through a prison intercom. Irregularities in medication billing. A federal audit triggered by routine record verification. Pierce's hand trembled as he listened, the phone pressing against his ear like a judge's gavel. He'd launched the background check on Brooke Sullivan, expecting it to bury her, never imagining it would excavate him instead. The Pentagon staffers reviewing church clinic records to verify Brooke's cover story had found what she'd noticed weeks ago while restocking bandages. The discrepancies. The phantom shipments. The medications billed to the diocese at triple market rate, authorization code signed by Pierce himself, inventory that never matched the billing statement submitted to the archdiocese. Federal auditors traced the paper trail like crime scene investigators following blood spatter. $340,000 in fraudulent reimbursements. Medications that disappeared from the clinic shelves and reappeared on the streets through Pierce's nephew, a small-time dealer in the 5 Points neighborhood who'd been moving pharmaceutical inventory for 18 months. Hydromorphone. Fentanyl patches. Benzodiazepines. Street value approximated at $783,000 across the distribution network. The investigator continued with the cadence of someone reading a death certificate. Termination of contract effective immediately. Cooperation with law enforcement requested this afternoon. Pierce set the phone down without responding and watched through his office window as the first military vehicles arrived at the church parking lot. They came in formation. A Chevy Suburban with government plates. 2 unmarked sedans. Then the bus, a charter bus pulling up to the curb with the deliberate slowness of a freight train entering a station. The side doors opened and they emerged like a tide, uniforms crisp and white against the gray Denver morning. 50 Navy SEALs in dress blues, every man standing 6 feet or taller, moving with the synchronized precision of individuals trained to breach buildings and clear rooms, now filing into a church sanctuary with the reverence of pallbearers. Commander Rake had made calls from his hospital bed during the night. Every SEAL he could reach. Every brother who'd served with the soldiers Brooke had dragged from that burning Humvee in Baghdad. Every operator who'd benefited from her innovations in field medicine, her protocols now taught at Naval Special Warfare Command. They came because a debt to the Valkyrie was a debt that transcended rank, time, and geography. The sanctuary doors closed behind them like the final closure of a case file. Through the frosted glass panel in his office door, Pierce watched their silhouettes form ranks, rifles held at parade rest, a show of force that transformed the church from a house of worship into a military court of honor. His phone buzzed. The diocese. Law enforcement. His lawyer, calling to advise immediate legal representation. Pierce silenced each call and watched. Inside the sanctuary, Brooke Sullivan stood in her captain's uniform, a uniform she'd buried 17 years ago in a duffel bag under old photographs and military discharge paperwork marked confidential. The fabric felt like returning to skin she'd outgrown. The fabric felt like coming home. Her son Marcus held the shadowbox against his chest, the medals catching light filtered through the stained glass, bronze star with velar device. Silver star. 2 purple hearts. And beneath them, folded with precision, the citation describing Captain Brooke Sullivan's exceptional courage under fire, extracting wounded personnel from a compromised position, 200 meters of active enemy engagement, 3 men carried including one Commander James Rake. The general, a 2-star who'd arrived at the church in the first vehicle, stood before her with the shadowbox open, each medal positioned for inspection and honor. The church held its breath. 50 uniformed SEALs stood motionless. The civilian congregation, church volunteers, neighbors, clinic patients Brooke had treated over 3 years of invisible service, sat in absolute silence, the kind of silence that occurs in operating rooms when every person understands the gravity of what they're witnessing. Captain Sullivan, the general began, his voice carrying the weight of official record and restored identity, your service to this nation, your valor in combat, your dedication to your brothers in arms. It is our profound honor to formally recognize your reinstatement with full military honors and to present these decorations for public acknowledgement of sacrifice that was previously classified. The first captain's bar slid onto her collar. The pins glinted gold. The general's hands moved with ceremonial precision, each movement a restoration, a resurrection of identity that the Pentagon had erased and buried and locked away in classified databases at the Defense Intelligence Agency. The bar settled into place with the weight of official recognition. Her rank was no longer a secret carried in jacket linings and buried under old paperwork. Commander Rake rose from his wheelchair, not without difficulty, gripping the armrests with both hands, movement slow and deliberate but determined, and a Navy chaplain moved to support him. 50 SEALs remained at perfect attention as Rake stepped forward, his eyes meeting Brooke's with the clarity of a man whose memory had been returning in fragments and pieces, each day bringing back another detail from that burning Humvee in the Jolin district, hands on his chest, pressing, the pressure, a woman's voice saying stay with me, fingers finding his airway. Her voice cutting through the noise and the fire and the chaos like a command that demanded obedience. Captain Sullivan, Rake said, and his voice carried the tremor of a man speaking through gratitude too profound for standard language, gave me my life twice. Once in Baghdad when she pulled me from that Humvee with rounds coming through the windshield. Once in this church when she brought me back from an aneurysm that should have taken me. He saluted, his hand rising from his side in the precise military gesture that meant respect transcending all rank and hierarchy. Some debts cannot be repaid. Only honored. The sanctuary exploded into motion. 50 Navy SEALs brought their right hands to their temples in unison, a salute that made the fluorescent light seem to vibrate, that made the wood floors resonate with a frequency that belonged to ceremony and recognition and the restoration of hidden sacrifice. Brooke returned the salute with her own hand rising steadily, no tremor, no hesitation, her voice when she spoke carrying the authority of someone who'd spent years commanding in silence and was now speaking in public for the first time. Thank you for your service, Commander. All of you. The honor is mutual. Through his office window, Pastor Pierce watched the military salute complete. His hands had stopped shaking because a new emotion had replaced fear, a hollow understanding that the investigation he'd launched to destroy a woman who noticed too much had become his own undoing with perfect, mechanical inevitability. His own phone calls to the diocese, the background check, the health department complaint, the lies about unauthorized medical practice, all of it had triggered the Pentagon's automatic alert system. All of it had forced federal auditors to cross-reference church records. All of it had exposed the medication fraud that he'd been orchestrating for 18 months through his nephew while a woman he'd tried to silence folded donated bandages in a church basement, too busy saving lives to notice that she was saving lives while her administrator was selling them. Two Denver police officers entered his office at 2:37 p.m. One of them held handcuffs that caught the fluorescent light like medical instruments designed for precision work. Pierce didn't resist. He simply stood, placed his hands together, and accepted the restraints with the composure of a man understanding that his empire, built on medication theft and bureaucratic manipulation and the assumption that he could crush anyone who threatened his authority, had collapsed not because of resistance but because of his own incompetence disguised as strategy. The sanctuary doors opened as the officers escorted him out. The 50 SEALs stood at attention in the parking lot, forming an informal corridor as Pierce was led to the patrol car. None of them spoke. None of them moved except to track his passage with their eyes. The message required no words. Sunday morning arrived with the church transformed. 50 Navy SEALs in dress white stood filling every pew, their uniforms bright against the dark wood, their presence converting the sanctuary from a space of prayer into a space of military honor ceremony. Commander Rake stood supported by 2 uniformed officers, his bearing military despite the weakness in his legs, his eyes clear and focused on the woman at the altar. Brooke Sullivan's captain's uniform hung perfect on her frame. Her son Marcus stood beside her holding the shadowbox, the medals visible to the entire congregation, a photographic inventory of sacrifice and valor that had been classified, hidden, denied, and now publicly restored. The general approached with the ceremonial pins, the captain's bars glinting gold in the sanctuary light, each bar a restoration of rank that had been stolen by bureaucracy and erased by secrecy protocols designed to bury operations that went wrong. The pin slid into place. The general's hands moved with ceremonial precision. The sanctuary remained absolutely silent except for the subtle sounds of dress uniforms settling, of boots shifting on the polished floor, of breathing held in recognition of something that transcended the ordinary moment of a Sunday service. When the bars were secured, locked into place by gravity and official decree, the general stepped back and saluted. The 50 Navy SEALs rose to their feet in unison and brought their right hands to their temples in a salute that held the weight of brothers honoring a sister, soldiers recognizing a soldier, operators acknowledging the Valkyrie of Baghdad returning from exile. Brooke's hand rose in response, steady and commanding, the gesture of someone who'd spent years in a subordinate position and was now claiming authority that belonged to her by right of service and sacrifice. Her voice when she spoke carried the register of a captain addressing her command, a voice that had been carefully modulated for 17 years to sound smaller than it was, and was now permitted to sound like the instrument of leadership it had always been. Thank you for your service, everyone. We serve because others cannot. That commitment, that devotion to something larger than ourselves, that's what binds us together. That's what brought many of you here this morning. That's what transforms ordinary citizens into brothers and sisters who would run into fire for each other without hesitation. The chaplain moved forward and the ceremony continued with the formality of full military honors, the church sanctuary operating now as an official space of military recognition and restoration, Denver civilians and active duty SEALs standing shoulder to shoulder as a woman who'd been erased from every database was formally restored to the record of service and valor that belonged to her. 3 months later, the church clinic was running under new leadership. Brooke Sullivan stood at the examination table with Commander Rake beside her, both of them now officially credentialed through Seattle General's outreach program, both of them training volunteers in emergency medicine protocols. The 75th Ranger Regiment patch was now sewn proudly to her uniform's shoulder, no longer hidden in jacket linings but displayed openly in a frame on the clinic wall alongside a photograph, 50 Navy SEALs standing at attention in the church sanctuary, their faces clear and their commitment visible, a promise kept and a debt honored. Marcus organized supplies in the back room, the bronze medal hanging on a chain around his neck, his mother's legacy now carried by her son, visible and acknowledged. On the wall behind the reception desk, a framed photo from the Sunday service showed the military salute in progress, 50 right hands raised in unison, Brooke's hand rising to meet them, her captain's bars catching light like a restoration made official and permanent. At Denver Community College, in a fluorescent-lit classroom that smelled of plastic and industrial cleaner, Pastor Pierce demonstrated chest compressions on a plastic mannequin to 14 teenagers who watched with expressions of profound indifference. His hand shook slightly as he pressed down and released, the mechanical rhythm of CPR performed without conviction by a man earning $15.50 per hour, a payment that represented everything he'd lost and everything he'd destroyed through his attempt to eliminate a woman who'd simply noticed too much. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of hidden strength and restored honor. Like this video if you believe that true heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. And comment below, what would you do if you discovered that the quiet person beside you was actually the strongest person in the room?